I wanted to walk you through one of the Millennium Villages, which is very close to my heart, although they all are, which is in the drylands region. It's in the northern part of Ethiopia, in an area called Koraro. And when we were looking at that area to choose it as, one of the next Millennium Villages, of which now there are 88. Now, by the way, the Millennium Villages encompasses 500,000 people. But at this point, this was only the second Millennium Village in 4.5 years ago. And when we arrived there, although we were looking for the most despondently difficult areas, when we arrived there, we actually thought that, and my overly optimistic husband thought that even this one was, that this one was even beyond his ability to see how it could be transformed, because in fact, all there was extremely parched land, rocks, and people. Extremely eroded terrain. As you can see here, although the people build these gabions, even that didn't hold the water back when this is an extremely dry region where it rains once a year, and because of the very high mountains or these stone formations that are incredibly beautiful, but because of them, when it rains once a year, it pours down with such force of nature that it completely gouges out the farmers' farms, and it completely washes off the topsoil. So what you're left with is almost no arable topsoil that could grow any crops, and you're also left with these completely gouged out areas, so that farmers would show us, a farmer showed me how it would take him a couple hours to go from one side of his little field to the other, only because he had to go around. So the terrain has been completely degraded and completely deprived of any topsoil, and the people's attempt to try to diffuse this incredible deluge of water with these rocks had very limited success, because the water comes down only once a year and only for a few days, but it comes down with such force that it does so notwithstanding. And in terms of potable water, women were going to what used to be a river, and now they're just digging at the dry bed, going down, using the dry bed just as a place where you're probably the lowest to the water aquifer, and so they're just digging for water in what used to be a river. And I actually interviewed one of the women, and I have it on I've written it up, where the woman was telling me, the woman with the canister, that she spent 6 hours a day getting water, because she makes 3 trips, and each one takes an hour there and an hour back. And this is where she gets it from. So what did this community do when we started working together, which, by the way, when we work together with a community in the Millennium Villages, it's not just, as somebody said before me, it's not like an NGO that sort of flies in and does its thing. We absolutely do a needs assessment with the community, with the regional officials, all under the auspices of the national government and the national leadership. And we work with the community, discussing with them what are their needs, what is it that they can do, what is it that they would be able to do if there were somebody lending a hand. And so we work very much in conjunction, because it's all done in a very what's the word that I'm looking for? In a very specific way of looking at the costing very carefully. So this is not gold plating a poor area. This is looking at what can be done along with the community, looking at any practical inputs, and we're doing a very careful costing study, making sure that all the interventions are within a very small budget, which I'll be glad to discuss if anybody has any questions afterwards. So in this case, what the people did is they built these gabions that they were able to build before, but because the project brought in the wire mesh, which cost just a couple $100, but if you don't have any money, then a couple $100 is the same as, a couple $1 million. So they built the gabions. They knew exactly where. You can see that this gabion, this holding wall, was built inside one of these incredibly gouged out ravines. They built them. They knew where. They knew how. And all that they required from the outside was the wire mesh to keep them in place. So these gabions are now dotting the entire area, and it's just been transformative. This is just an example of a spring that the women used to walk to this spring up in the mountains that would take them an hour or two to walk up to it, and by just putting a pipe, so they knew where to do it, they built the protected spring, and the project gave them the pipe, and so the women now have the pipe going all the way down to the villages. This is just an example of small-scale irrigation that a lot of the schools and some of the households had. Percolation ponds, just a simple pond so that when the water rushes through from these huge mountains and it rushes through and washes everything away, this just allows the water to sit a little bit longer so that it percolates and hopefully recharges the aquifers. Then there's this other kind of pond, which is an irrigation pond, which again, the people themselves excavated, but what they didn't have is the money for the tarp, which just cost a couple $100. And so these ponds are, of course, meant to retain the water for irrigating the field. So they're percolation ponds, and there are about 100 of these, and then there are these retention ponds for irrigation. And we've been working with this community for about 4.5 years, and I have to tell you that when I went there just a couple of months ago, I was almost in tears because I could not recognize the completely transformed landscape. I have never seen a landscape be transformed by people's, there's no machinery. This is all done by the villagers themselves with just a little bit of technical support and some of these minor items that they could not afford. This village now is thriving. It has doubled its yield. It now has surplus of harvest, which they're taking to the market. They now have finally some cash, so they're diversifying in other forms of livelihoods. They have some cash crops. We are measuring very carefully in a pretty controlled way. We're measuring. We're first of all doing heavy-duty surveys, blood tests, stool tests, anthropometric measurements, and the results are very encouraging and soon to be published that children are much less malnourished than they were before. Stunting has gone down, child mortality has gone down, as well as maternal mortality, and it's really very encouraging. So this is just an example of one region in the drylands that was absolutely one of the most despondently poor regions that I've ever seen, with a life expectancy of about 30, with basically no forms of livelihood in between the harvests. Now, as you see, just 4 years later, there's almost a downtown Corraro, is what the local management people call it. As you see, all the roofs have corrugated tin, and there really is much better hope for sustainability in the future. So that's just one community doing all the work on their own with other partners such as World Food Program that does the Food for Work program, and us and others. The other region that's incredibly affected by the droughts and exacerbated by El Nino is in northeast province of Kenya, which is very close to the Somali border. And that area does not grow any food. It's purely livestock, pastoralists, very difficult area. And just helping the community with a $15,000 generator-driven pump has transformed that community in that because livestock is the organizing, sort of the organizing principle of this community. The fact that they weren't able to give water to their livestock and some other interventions has made all the difference. In Senegal, in that drylands area, there the solution was long-distance piping, 110 kilometers of pipes that were provided by JM Eagle to the village group. And then the other adaptation to the immense droughts is insurance schemes. One kind of insurance scheme is just crop diversification, which, by the way, I just happened to see 3 days ago in Malawi, where the community in Malawi, 50,000 people, had experienced an extreme drought, and so their maize was absolutely a failure. Their corn was a failure, but they quickly, on the recommendation of the management team, that's the technical advice that we provide, put in seeds for sweet potato and groundnuts